Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Institute for Government. My name is Peter Riddle. I'm the director here, and welcome to the start of our autumn season of public events, and an absolutely fascinating one it will be. On my right sitting there is Michael Dugher, who is the Shadow Minister for the Cabinet Office, as well as a number of other roles, some of which are going to draw him away from here shortly after 1:30. He's also Vice Chair of the Labour Party. He only became an MP in 2010. He'd worked very closely at the centre before then, and around Whitehall. He worked very closely for Gordon Brown at the final period of the Labour government, but also he'd worked as an advisor in a number of departments. Around Whitehall, also, he reminded me he came here when he was working for the Leader of the House, when slightly shabbier premises in those days. We're glad to have smartened it up a bit since then, although in that way. Now, we're delighted to have Michael here today to talk about Labour's plans for civil service reform, because we're less than 8 months from an election, and one of the key themes of a lot of the Institute for Government work is how political parties, both those who are in government and those in opposition, need to prepare better for government and to think out how they all govern. And we did work on this before the last election. We're doing it again now, working with the political parties, I say both those in government and in opposition in that respect. We also produced a report which is very relevant to what Michael's going to be saying shortly, on the role of the centre, the political centre, the units around the centre, because one of the things we've noticed is incoming governments tend to change round the furniture rather often quite dramatically. And our view is that they should study what the furniture is. They may want to change it a bit, but not to take an all-for-nothing view, merely because something was introduced by one government, to do away with it, because there are common features and common needs of any Prime Minister of any government. So the central feature of our report, which we produced in July, which have to be addressed by whoever the Prime Minister is. And one of the problems of past governments is they've tended to undo things which have been done by their predecessors, only to reinvent them, usually under another name later on. So there's an argument for recognising the good things which have happened. And I think one of the interesting things of what we're going to be hearing from Michael is some aspects of change, but also of continuity. So Michael will be talking for about 20 minutes. I'll ask some questions, and then we'll open it up for a limited number of questions from the floor. Michael Dugher.
Thank you, Peter, for giving this opportunity. You mentioned it was a bit shabbier, this building, in those days. I thought it was quite... It seemed pretty impressive to me at the time, which was, I suppose, one of the reasons why we flogged it off. But I remember I worked here from 2005 to 2006. I remember we had a reception, drinks reception, for all those new MPs who got elected in 2005. And I distinctly remember, I think in this room, having a conversation with a sort of bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, enthusiastic, keen new Member of Parliament called Ed Miliband. And we got on famously well, despite the fact that he'd kicked my arse in the selection for the seat some 3 months before. I remember thinking, this building, fantastic building, so no surprise at all that we got rid of it. But it's fantastic to be here. And I want to thank, if I may, first by congratulating the Institute for Government on the work that they've been doing, not just in hosting this event. I think for an organisation that was only founded 6 years ago, it's had a remarkable impact already in encouraging and informing the debate around the effectiveness of government, whether it's through publications, seminars, conferences, meetings like this. I think we had a Shadow Cabinet away day as well in this room. So in its short history, the Institute has provided invaluable insight for both the government of the day, but also for the official opposition, and long may that continue. As Peter said in his introduction, I'm here to talk about the civil service and to outline some of Labour's thinking on reform as we enter the final 9 months of the general election. The capability and effectiveness of the civil service is perhaps now under greater scrutiny than it has been for decades, and this is understandable. We're having to grapple with the reality of the financial constraints that we're under, coupled with the complex challenges facing policymakers and public service providers. And on top of this, whilst the money may be in shorter supply, public expectations are constantly rising. And just with the customers of private companies, people now expect better, more responsive, more accessible, more personalised public services that are easier to use, more transparent and delivered at lower costs. And it's widely acknowledged that extensive reforms are required to meet these new demands and challenges, and I'll move on to some of those areas that are in our thinking at this stage shortly. But I think it's important to start by putting things in context. Now, contrary to what you might believe from some ministers in the current government and some media reports, the civil service is far from broken. It remains an incredible institution and one that I have a huge admiration for. It lives and breathes its core values of integrity, honesty, impartiality and objectivity. And it is outstanding in its ability to transfer expertise and loyalty from one government to the next. So rather than this negative caricature of civil servants painted by some ministers, where somehow officials are constantly trying to block ministers' desire for change and whereby the civil service is the problem, not part of the solution, I believe that overall a defining feature of the civil service is its willingness to help drive change and to make things better. Indeed, change is not a new phenomenon for the civil service. In my experience, often it's the civil servants themselves, the people who can see at first hand from the inside where the deficiencies are, who are often the strongest advocates for reform. And there's no doubt the British civil service is amongst one of the best in the world. So it's now time to take it to the next level. And the question is, how do we sustain those core values and the great qualities that the civil service has had over so many years, whilst bringing about the major transformations that the times demand? So firstly, let's look at what the government has done over the last 4 years. Some progress has undoubtedly been made, but we've also seen a number of mistakes and missed opportunities. Success has been patchy, to say the least. In 2010, ministers were slow to start and didn't fully comprehend, in my view, what was needed. Rather than having a comprehensive reform plan from the outset, the government concentrated on an immediate redundancy programme in the pursuit of short-term savings. And these staffing cuts were undertaken in an ill-thought-through and chaotic fashion, which ironically has exasperated many of the problems the government is now trying to resolve around key capabilities and skills, particularly in commissioning and project management and other areas too. I've also been critical of Francis Maude's personal approach, which has varied at times from a bull in a china shop to acting like a man trying to fight everyone in the pub at the same time. Now, however, there have been a number of improvements that ought to be acknowledged, and Labour will do that today. Improvements that we will seek to build on. These include the major projects authority and the work to control large government projects, although the MPA still lacks enough teeth, the advancement of the shared services agenda, more rigorous objectives for permanent secretaries, certain spending controls from the centre over common activities, attempts to build a stronger corporate centre with the Crown Commercial Service and the Government Digital Service, more accountability for accounting officers and senior responsible officers and extended ministerial officers. All of these and a number of other reforms will require further improvements, but they are a step in the right direction, and indeed many of them are a continuation of the changes started under the previous Labour government. Turning to one area that the government has looked at in some detail, that's the appointment of permanent secretaries. It's Labour's view that ministers should indeed have more involvement in the appointment of permanent secretaries. Ministers are rightly held to account to Parliament for the performance of their departments, so it's our view that it's only right that they should have a stronger say in the most important recruitment decision affecting their department. As with the model suggested by the IPPR and supported by both the current government and indeed by the Institute for Government, the Prime Minister should be able to choose, after consulting the relevant Secretary of State, from a list of above-the-line candidates. Of course, there must still be rigorous merit-based assessment preceding the exercise of ministerial choice, and appointed candidates must be bound by the existing civil service code and values, I'm absolutely clear that the civil service must remain impartial and that advice to ministers is given without fear or favour. There can be no politicisation of the civil service. But with the proposed strict procedures around ministerial involvement in appointments, I cannot personally see any increased risk of politicisation, only a system that is more accountable and more effective. And in other Westminster model democracies, the Prime Minister does appoint top civil servants, and the proposed system of what's called constrained ministerial choice is precisely how the government makes hundreds of public appointments, including to highly important independent posts such as who chairs the UK Statistics Authority, Ofgem or the BBC Trust. I can say today that Labour also support government moves to strengthen the level of support given to ministers through extended ministerial offices. Ministers should be able to expand their ministerial private offices with a small number of expert advisors recruited from inside or outside the civil service and who report directly to them. This should, of course, be subject to the same recruitment procedures, the same selection based on merit and the same financial constraints. But extended ministerial offices, I think, will be good for the civil service and ensure that ministers have the sufficient capacity to cope with increasing demands. In my experience, we mentioned my time as a special advisor, I think some of the difficulties, certainly that the previous government got into with special advisors, was that ministers felt compelled to use the SPADS system, not as using special advisors as political advisors, but to plug perceived skills and capability gaps in areas such as communications, progress chasing, policy expertise. And I think EMOs, the extended ministerial offices, should help to deal with some of those problems. But despite some of the progress that I've outlined, the pace of civil service reform overall has been disappointing, and there have been mistakes. I think one of the first mistakes was to split the position of the head of the civil service and the cabinet secretary. This hampered reform efforts by weakening the role of the head of the civil service, compounded by the fact that Sir Bob Kerslake retained his position as a departmental permanent secretary. It's welcome that the government has now ended this arrangement. It was recently announced that the new Chief Executive Officer of the Civil Service will be appointed. However, it looks like the proposed position could also lack the authority it needs to help drive forward real reform. The job description for the newly created position shows that the new role will not be a Chief Executive in any sense recognised in either the private or indeed public sectors. The idea of strengthening the central leadership around civil service reform is a positive step, but the holder of this new post will not be responsible for either running the civil service or line managing permanent secretaries, and he or she will themselves have multiple line managers. Ironically, the civil service reform programme under this government has struggled with some of the problems highlighted in its own report. Okay at policy, not so good at delivery. And in recent years, there have been a broader weakness in my view, in the centre of government. One of the principal mistakes has been the fact that since becoming Prime Minister, David Cameron has overseen a significant deterioration of the centre of government's ability to coordinate and to see the effective implementation and delivery of policies. Now, David Cameron is famous for having more holidays than Judith Chalmers and more days off than Father Christmas. But in the same way Tony Blair was criticised for sofa government, I think Cameron's style is more sun lounger government. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong, he says, as an aspiring minister, with ministers taking well-earned vacations with their families. But in many ways, David Cameron's sort of holiday schedule and perceptions of that has become symbolic of the current Prime Minister's wider approach to the job. David Cameron's chillaxing approach, as it's called, of hands off and feet up, has extended to his approach to departmental agendas, and a weak centre has contributed, in my view, to some of the failures, some of the many costly failures that we've seen. Because the problems with delivery and effective implementation are not just about the personality of the Prime Minister, they're about how the centre is set up and how it operates. People have been highlighting the problem of silos within Whitehall for many years, including under this government, yet departments have been acting even more in silos since 2010. Rather than working on important cross-government initiatives or corporate civil service reforms, ministers are still focusing too much on their own pet projects. This approach from the top has resulted in a real lack of focus and accountability for implementation across Whitehall. It's clear that departments now feel substantially less scrutinised and held to account than they did in 2010. The result has been a catalogue of broken promises and failures to deliver. These include the government missing its own defining debt and deficit targets, more than 190 billion more than they planned, the failing flagship universal credit programme with already 140 million wasted on IT, the missed targets on immigration, and the botched and costly reorganisation of the National Health Service. It's instructive that one of David Cameron's first decisions as Prime Minister was to scrap the Prime Minister's delivery unit, the Cabinet Office Strategy Unit, and the public service agreements. This removed much of the cross-departmental coordination, accountability and scrutiny that had been built up over the previous decade. The move was short-sighted, with changes being made just to show that this government was different to the previous lot. But in 2012, realising, I think, the mistake following a host of policy problems, such as the beleaguered Health and Social Care Bill, which had over 1,000 amendments in Parliament, the government quietly did set up the implementation unit in the Cabinet Office to try and rebuild some of the successful cross-departmental oversight that the former Prime Minister's delivery unit had possessed. Now, this small unit has utilised some of the methods employed by the former PMDU, but it has far less resources. It doesn't have the same political backing or authority across Whitehall as its predecessor. And the overall structure also lacks sufficient collaboration between Number 10, the Cabinet Office and other departments, a classic case of too little too late. The government has introduced departmental business plans instead of public service agreements, but these are also clearly lacking in the adequate accountability mechanism and the ability to really drive performance. It's telling that one of the Institute for Government's recent reports, I read a civil servant who was quoted as saying, and I quote, "I've never felt less scrutinised by the centre and less held to account by the centre, which is very lovely in some sense, but it feels completely wrong." So what we need is a comprehensive performance management framework for government. To get things back on track, Labour will introduce reforms to set up a new delivery and performance regime at the heart of government to drive through key priorities, ensure better coordination and bring in more commercial expertise. The next government will have a lot to do to move the country forward, and we'll have some serious inherited problems like universal credit or the border controls to manage. We will have to be ruthlessly focused in driving delivery. We'll need to use all the expertise and cooperation that the civil service can muster. With Number 10, the Cabinet Office and the Treasury working closely together, the next Labour government will ensure greater accountability and concentrate efforts on core sets of outcome-based priorities. And this reform to strengthen the centre of government, to improve implementation and accountability, forms part of our thinking on how we can confront the fundamental problem of departmental silos. Loyalties of civil servants tend to lie with their department and relevant minister, or more often relevant permanent secretary, which can lead to a short-term approach. Focus on projects that cut across departments can quickly be lost as officials naturally revert to alternative priorities set out by their departmental minister. Now, this problem is, of course, far from new. But more and more, the issue that we will have to deal with, the long-term trends such as in health and climate change, opportunities of opening up big data, this will require more cross-departmental working. Sometimes temporary specialist units working from the centre are the answer, and these have been effective in the past, such as the Social Exclusion Task Force. But we also need longer-term imaginative ideas to make sure that we've got proper cooperation between departments with joint accountability, on the pressing cross-departmental issues. Now, whether it's increasing the number of ministers who straddle departments so that they can bring together teams from different departments on particular issues, or more imaginative funding arrangements with pooled budgets and incentives for departments to cooperate. This is an area that needs significant improvement and one that we are currently exploring. Too often we've seen weak attempts to address this problem with coordination meetings that just sound good and give a sense of activity when briefed to the media. But people turn up to massive meetings on an infrequent basis to coordinate on a particular issue, but then they go back to their departments to work in isolation on something that their boss is not accountable for. I'd like to touch now, if I may, on something absolutely crucial to the future success of the civil service, and that's this whole area of capability and skills. The civil service has very many talented people, but it's widely acknowledged that there are still significant gaps in capabilities and skills. In particular, we need more expertise in digital technology, project management, commercial contracting and commissioning. But the government's progress on this front so far has been painfully slow and in some areas has even gone backwards. In 2010, rather than having a comprehensive plan from the outset looking at how to improve the performance and efficiency of the civil service in the long term, the government concentrated on that redundancy programme to enable the short-term savings that fitted with the political cycle. As a consequence, we've seen the hollowing out of skills, expertise and experience in many departments and agencies. The Government Capabilities Plan, finally published in 2013, has brought some welcome clarity and a commitment to take a more strategic approach. It's a case of better late than never, I think, which is why we supported many of the ideas contained in the plan, from better talent management and the introduction of the project leadership programme to putting digital and technology skills right at the forefront. We've also supported reforms around capabilities in the civil service reform plan, such as the new competency framework, the Future Leaders Scheme, the requirement for permanent secretaries to have more operational experience. It seems that the government has finally woken up to this issue, but the next step has got to be delivery. Now, Labour is under no illusions that the significant gaps in capabilities and skills will remain in 2015. We'll seek to build on the current government's attempted reforms and put in place the sustained leadership and engagement that is needed to deliver. So we'll act quickly to publish a refreshed capability plan for the civil service within the first year of government. This comprehensive review and capability plan will include first a full audit of all capabilities within the civil service. As the NAO has stated, there is still a lack of reliable data on skills, professional qualifications and experience in our current civil service. Second, a review of the specialist professions within the civil service. A major part of Labour's review of skills and capabilities will include new steps to strengthen the professions within the civil service. The government has highlighted this, but we need to go further. Expertise and professional groups should be at the heart of deploying capable people to where they are needed the most across the civil service. Third, a plan of action to cut down on the frequency of rotation of staff within the civil service. The government has said that there should be a minimum terms for senior responsible officers, but we need to go further. Too often staff on key projects are moved on to completely different roles before the project is complete. This leads to poor institutional memory, and we want to see less frequent rotations of staff across the whole of the civil service. And there must also be a culture of consequences for poor performers. Fourth, and finally, a new framework to ensure that more jobs are advertised externally so that people with the necessary skills can be brought into the civil service. Many more of the positions that become available within the civil service should be opened out so that external candidates can apply. We also want to see more secondments, both of civil servants going out into the private sector, as well as private sector employees coming into the civil service. This is something the government has been slow to make headway on. As I set out earlier before the summer, in another speech, another priority for Labour will be to improve the diversity of the civil service, to ensure that we have a civil service that is more in touch with and more representative of the civil society that it seeks to serve. In this way, it will not only become more representative, but also more effective. This is an area that will require particular attention as things have either been stalling or in fact getting worse under the current government. To turn things around, we announced 2 major reforms before the summer. First, we'll reform the fast stream to open up the civil service to more people from non-traditional backgrounds, in particular from ethnic minorities and working class graduates. Our changes will ensure many more BME and working class candidates can enter the fast stream over the course of the next Parliament and create a new generation of future civil service leaders who are more reflective of the country. Second, we'll set new diversity targets for the senior civil service to meet by 2020. We want women to make up at least 45% of all senior civil servants, and for BME staff to make up at least 8% of the senior civil service by 2020. To achieve this, we did announce before the summer a clear 6-point plan. It's our view that the government has lost sight of the diversity agenda in the civil service, and we are determined to act where the current government has failed. But lastly, again, something I talked about before the summer, and something really it touches upon my opening remarks, an important change that Labour will seek to instil is a new culture of respect between ministers and civil servants. You have to take people with you if you want the best from them. Only a motivated, committed and well-led civil service can achieve what we want them to achieve. As I said at the outset, civil servants at the moment currently feel made to feel like they're part of the problem rather than part of the solution. The Prime Minister, for example, described Whitehall, quotes, as the enemy of enterprise in a speech in 2011. This kind of attitude is wholly counterproductive and has led to many civil servants feeling demoralised, demotivated and undervalued. The Civil Service People's Survey shows that the overall engagement index of civil servants has fallen in 70% of departments since 2009. So Labour wants to see a re-energised civil service that feels valued and motivated to help implement the vital reforms that the country needs. So to finish, Labour's committed to continued reform of the civil service. We will introduce that new culture of respect, more diversity to make the civil service more representative and effective, a new capability plan for the civil service to address the significant gaps in capabilities and skills, a stronger centre to improve coordination, performance, delivery and accountability, and better leadership in departments. We'll acknowledge and build on some of the positive reforms that have been undertaken in recent years. Labour has a proud tradition of civil service reform and we want to take that forward in 2015. Ultimately, we want a civil service that can deliver better outcomes for the public, and this will be the focus of our work over the coming months as we head towards that general election. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. A lot of meat there, a lot for people to ask questions on. I'm just going to ask a very few at the beginning, because you covered a very wide range of areas, and I'm very grateful for you choosing the IFG for making these series of announcements. The emphasis seems to be almost more on continuity than change.
It's a bit of both. We're going to change the things that are not working well, and we're going to continue the things that we think are. And in truth, in fairness, a lot of the reforms that the government has introduced are in themselves a continuation of some things introduced by the previous government. I thought you were right in the point you made at the beginning, Peter, which is, I think too often there's a sort of temptation with a new government to almost for its sake say we're going to change everything. I just don't think that that is a practical and sensible approach. I think we should look at what works, because that's ultimately what's best, and that's what we'll do.
Now, you had experience at the centre. I mean, you couldn't have had a kind of more testing one at the final year or so of the Brown government.
There's not a lot of chillaxing, I seem to remember.
Not a lot of chillaxing, no.
My last employer.
No, I think we'd all agree on that. What lessons did you learn from that about relations between the centre and departments? Because what you're saying here is you want a strong centre. You're talking about a new development, a new delivery and performance regime, and so on. So what lessons did you learn about what that balance? Because inevitably it's going to be a difficult balance between the centre and the big departments.
I think you've got to get the balance right between having a clear sense of a big plan for the future of the country, the big changes that you want to make, where you want to get to in the medium and longer term, as well as having an ability to deal effectively with those day-to-day things that the kind of world just throws at you. And I think sometimes, you know, ministers are perhaps more focused on the day-to-day and less on the strategy. I think that culture of respect is really important, because I think, you know, the centre of government can be quite a testing place to be, but you've got to get the best out of people, and you've got to work with people. And I think that's something that is very, very important. I think my criticism of this government is, I think they came in at the beginning, and it's a bit like with the centre, I think they sort of saw the strong accountability, coordination, the strong centre as being about big government and about Labour's target culture. And I think for quite political and ideological reasons, they got rid of lots of things that actually, from their own point of view, have made it harder for them to deliver. And of course, the big issue that all of us are facing on all sides of the political spectrum is that demand from the public. You know, rightly, they want more from their government. They're probably more cynical towards us in terms of what we can deliver, but they are incredibly demanding. So how you kind of show the public that you can deliver what you promise, and that you can manage things effectively and deliver the changes is a big challenge for all of us.
Yeah, how would your suggested delivery and performance regime differ from the reinvented implementation unit or the delivery unit you were familiar with in your years?
I mean, the regime that we want to put in place will be much closer to the old Prime Minister's delivery unit. The implementation unit, I think, is a bit of an afterthought. So it's not very clear about exactly how many people are involved, but it has far less resources than was the case 10 years before. We're not talking about, you know, we want to bring in more commercial expertise, but you can go and get people from within other departments and within the centre itself, but it has far less people, far less resources. It also doesn't have the same, I think, same leadership, the same political authority, and the same political engagement as well. So it wasn't just having the delivery unit in the past, it was also those PSAs, which were much more performance targets. So not just having a business plan that had a kind of set of, here's some things we'd like to do. It was about driving, about performance managing, and that included those regular stock takes that the Prime Minister himself, with the Cabinet Secretary, with others, would have with departmental permanent secretaries and secretaries of state. And that, in my recollection, really did focus people's minds.
Now, you made, in the speech, I mean, just picking two areas out, and there are a lot more I could do, you endorse extended ministerial offices. How big would you want them? Because, as you said, that, you know, in practice, there were some of the unfortunate incidents which occurred in the past with people being classified in the wrong posts, and it'd be much better to be more open and bring in expertise. But one of the arguments on that is if you make it too big, you cut off the minister from the department. The continental cabinet system used in Brussels or in France or so on, is, you can argue in Brussels is justified because you're talking about a multinational organisation. But in other cases, it just cuts them. In Australia, for example, in Canberra is a classic example. Yep. You have lots and lots of advisors to ministers, but the regular civil servants are cut off.
Well, I don't think it should be increasing that detachment. It should actually be bringing the two more closely together. I mean, that's, in truth, that's what good private office already does. Within departments, all the government is talking about, which we support, is how can you augment that? And we're not talking about a cabinet system or bringing dozens of extra people in, but I think a Secretary of State, in discussion with the Permanent Secretary, ought to be able to have a conversation about particular priorities and particular needs, and about whether or not those capabilities do exist within their private office, within the ministerial office, and whether there's a need either to get them from elsewhere in the department or to get them from outside. So I think what the government's proposed is actually, it's a very sort of British reform, really. I think it's quite a gentle evolution, but I think it's a really, really important one that I think could make a big difference, and we're very strongly supportive of that.
The other innovation you referred to in your speech is the new CEO of the civil service. Yeah. Applications ended on a Friday. No doubt 1 or 2 people in this room put their applications in. Who knows? You endorse it in principle, but you have some qualifications.
Well, I think it's got to be able to do the job. You know, I think it shouldn't just be called a chief executive. I think it should be sort of a chief executive. And I think we're a bit concerned when we've looked at some of the detail about reporting lines, about exactly how the role is constructed. Now, it's not too late for the government to make adjustments and changes, and we're happy to talk to them about that. But I think we were actually looking ourselves, and I sort of joked with Francis Maud about this recently, of a sort of a similar kind of role in some of the changes that we were looking to bring in. But it really has got to kind of do the job that it's tasked with. And I'm not sure at the moment how it's structured. It will. And we don't want to have what happened before, where something really was set up to fail. And I think that was a missed opportunity.
Because as you point out, and certainly the IFG view, it's not a conventional chief executive post as to be recognised in the private sector or the public or other parts of the public sector. But it doesn't, you know, permanent secretaries don't report to the proposed new chief executive officer.
Exactly.
Right, let me open up for questions. I'm sure we have quite a few. Could you say who you are? Ollie.
Quick factual things. On the chief executive post, would you, if you get power, give them line managing responsibilities for permanent secretaries? And on this idea of cross-departmental ministers, do you see them being at cabinet level or below that?
Well, they're good questions, and you wrote a very good piece this morning, I thought, for the Independent, extremely well briefed. In terms of the chief executive role, I mean, look, we'd like the government to. The election is several months off. We'd rather the government made the necessary changes now. So we'll have to look at what situation we inherit. Equally, on the point about cross-departmental ministers, we've actually got a group on our own side that meets. That's a number of people from Shadow Cabinet, but also a number of individuals who very privately advise us, who are very senior business figures and very senior former civil servants who are currently working with us on looking at much of this detail. So you'll have to wait, I'm afraid.
Gentlemen, I'll come to you in a second. Gentleman at the back, next to you, Kerry. Yep.
Non-executive at HM Treasury. You mentioned the problem of excessive rotation of civil service between roles. And I think if you want to address that, can I suggest one thing that is part of the problem there, which is that it's the only way to get promoted is to move around in the civil service. And in the private sector, you will quite often get promoted in role because you're doing a very good job. And I think unless you can address the question of how can people be promoted while they're continuing to do the job they're doing, I think the rotation issue will continue to be a problem.
No, I entirely agree. They're kind of, at the moment, they're sort of the perverse incentives that actually compound the problem that we've got. So I think we have got to make those changes so that you can, we don't want continuity for all the right reasons being a way of, you know, sticking people, limiting people's career opportunities. I think people are entitled to, good people should make progress and go onwards and upwards, but we do have to deal with that continuity issue. I think we've got to remove some of these perverse incentives that you rightly highlight.
Absolutely. Jonathan?
Jonathan Isby from the Taxpayers Alliance. We all know money is very tight in government. I think one of the best things the current lot have done is to, in terms of helping deliver value for money, is on spending transparency, making sure that taxpayers can see where their money is going, what contracts are being signed, who's paying who what, and how much. At the moment, a lot of that is simply done just because it's done, not because it has to be done, and a future government could change it. Will you commit a Labour government, if elected, to continuing with all that spending transparency and indeed building on it and making the numbers even more accessible?
Yeah, and we agree with that. But I mean, kind of before we, you know, hand out Transparency of the Year awards to the kind of current government, it's worth bearing in mind that sometimes that contract transparency is not all it seems. I've had private conversations with big suppliers who, remember in the early days of the government, they were able to sort of renegotiate these contracts and, you know, and got a much better deal. And I remember chatting to one supplier and just, you know, how did they do that? A very reasonable question to ask. And he said, well, it wasn't because they're going to get more for less. He said, if they're going to pay less, they just got less. So we sat down and said, if you say the new budget is this amount, if you've got less to spend, we can do that. We can rework the contract for you, but we'll just deliver you less. It's not going to affect our profits or returns to shareholders. Now, there's absolutely no transparency in relation to any of that at all. So I think sometimes the government is better at the rhetoric of transparency. But I admit there have been improvements, and we want to make continued improvements, because that accountability is also one of the most important ways that you change performance.
Yep. Like
Winnie Akban-Hill from Civil Service World. You said you wanted more ministerial involvement in picking permanent secretaries, ideally from a short list, but you also said that the civil service must remain neutral and objective and cannot be politicised. How do you, isn't there a real danger of ministers picking from a short list of the civil service becoming politicised? And also, I believe the Civil Service Commission has already rejected that approach, so how would you envisage that reform?
Well, the proposals, as I understand it, do contain quite a number of important safeguards, I think, that ensure that you wouldn't have that politicisation, this above-the-line choice. I think the government has come up with a decent proposal to ensure you do have, rightly, the proper safeguards that you've highlighted. In terms of the attitude of the Civil Service Commission, what the Civil Service Commission basically said was, on the back of the Public Administration Select Committee's view, that there wasn't parliamentary consensus, so we'll just wait and see in terms of the change. Well, on the basis that we've made our announcement today, it strikes me, if you've got the support of Labour in the House of Commons and you've got the support of the governing parties in the House of Commons, that looks to me like the beginning of quite a powerful consensus, and I hope that's something that the Commission will reflect upon.
Well, I think the Commission has someone here who can reflect on it. And I see he's nodding on that. I may not want to say any more at this stage. Right, further questions? Yep.
Imran Mia from the think tank Social Market Foundation. In speaking today, you didn't talk about decentralization or localism, but you did talk about a much stronger centre that has much stronger scrutiny of delivery and implementation and performance. Would you expect that new centre to also provide that scrutiny for the local places that have had money and power devolved to them?
I certainly think you need proper safeguards and checks. I mean, this is public money. Now, I find it quite an interesting question, actually. There's this sort of perceived complaint that we're not talking enough about devolution and handing things away from the centre. That is the big policy agenda that Labour has for after the election. What I'm really talking about is the centre of government, and ensuring that you have proper coordination and proper performance management in place. But in terms of the broader direction of travel, we want the spend to be made as close to people locally as possible, absolutely. So much more involvement of the business community, so all the proposals that we've made in relation to devolving quite large amounts of spend away from Whitehall. But that doesn't mean that you, at the same time, just take your foot off the gas at the centre and then have no kind of oversight or no coordination from the centre, because ultimately the public will look to the government to understand why you're not delivering the things that you said you would. So I think it's about getting the balance right, and I think the two actually are entirely complementary.
Could I actually just sing over in here, remind you of one of his past roles? One thing you didn't refer to was reorganisation within departments, particularly what's been taken much further forward since you're an advisor is the idea of having non-executive directors on the boards of departments. And you didn't mention that in the speech. I mean, you did a lot, so you've got the credit, but I just wondered what your view was on that.
I think that's been one of the positive changes, actually. I think it's a bit patchy. I think some departments have been better at it than others. I also sort of anecdotally get the impression that where you've got ministers, secretaries of states who are genuine about engaging with the non-executive directors, it has provided a really useful source of alternative advice. I think it's been patchy because I think if you've got ministers, secretaries of state, senior officials who are not that interested in it, I think that's a bit of a problem. I think you've got to kind of watch exactly who these people are as well. I don't think they can be just appoint a bunch of sort of political chums to agree with ministers, and somehow that's third-party endorsement. But I think it's been a really welcome development, the non-execs, and I think we would want to continue and increase that, but really make it work well.
Right. The question then, I'll come to you in a sec. Yeah, question there. Yeah, thanks.
Hi, Tim Hughes from the think tank Involve. A part of this current government's civil service reform plan was around open policy making. I wondered if you could say a bit about the role you think there is for openness within the policy process and what a Labour government would do on that.
Well, I think that's something that we've embraced. So in terms of how the Labour Party formally makes its policy, it's now formally opened up. So the old days of, the motions at the Labour Party conference in Blackpool are kind of, those days in terms of how we made our policy are long, long gone with the National Policy Forum. But also I think the other things I've been really encouraged with since 2010 is the willingness for colleagues to really learn the lessons. So I think we've had a number of very, very wide-ranging, powerful reviews, often headed by people who are not necessarily kind of identified as Labour Party people, whether it's Stevens, from the Met, former head of the Met, heading up our review into policing. We've had a number of reviews. I worked in 2010-11 on one around defence procurement, where we got a number of very, very senior outsiders who are people who'd never really had anything to do with Labour politicians before. And we were saying, look, there are not many advantages from losing an election, but one of them is that you do get that chance and that opportunity to reconsider, to think about your record, to think about what you did well and what you didn't, and to learn those lessons. So I think we've proved actually over the last few years a real serious willingness to open up our policy making to whether it's think tanks or whether it's outside stakeholders, experts, and certainly as we approach the next few months in civil service reform, I've had many meetings with senior civil servants, retired permanent secretaries, the trade unions as well, absolutely vital voice in all of this, the people who represent people at the shop, and that's a process that will continue as we begin to develop some of these ideas over the next several months.
Sue.
Sue Cameron, Telegraph. You said that you want to see more people coming in to the civil service from outside, and you identified some of the skills and capability gaps as project management, commissioning, IT, which I'm sure everybody would agree with. The trouble with getting these brilliant outsiders in who are fantastic project managers is that they can earn 3, 4, 5 times more outside than in the civil service. So how much will you be prepared to pay these new outsiders? 400,000? 500,000? What sort of sum will you entice them in with?
I'm certainly not, however tempting, going to make any spending commitments today. Actually, it's not just about bringing experts. I think the phrase that I used very carefully in my speech was expertise. So I think it's not just about bringing individuals in. I think we've got to bring expertise in. I think one of the unfortunate things, we lost expertise and some experts actually in some of the changes, because it sort of connects to the point that you made. A lot of the people who went in that first period when the government did those big redundancies were often people with that kind of expertise. So I think it's a big problem that we face up to. There are models of success though. I think of the head of defence exports that originally was in DSO and the MOD that moved to UKTI. That's quite a good model where you've got someone whose job it is to be the head of defence exports. Now clearly having someone with a lot of commercial expertise in that sector is essential to do that. So what happened, the previous government, is a chief executive of a commercial company in that field was brought into government. And actually in those circumstances, this wouldn't work in other areas, but where industry then made contributions to that, recognising that they had an interest in this person being successful. It was good for the UK PLC, but good for them commercially, so that they contributed to that, so that in a sense, UK PLC was able to afford someone who could do a really good job for the country. as well as for industry. And that was just one model where we managed to bring an outsider. They became a sort of temporary civil servant, a fixed term contract, but their remuneration was slightly different.
Right, got two in the front row. Mark, one there, one there.
Thank you. Alan Evans, head of the Scotland office. In 1997, when the Labour government came in, they inherited a machinery of government and made a number of changes to it, such that by 2010 there were only 4 departments in the same format as Labour inherited in 1997. By contrast, the current government made very few machinery government changes. What's your perspective on what a Labour government might do in the machinery of government that it inherits? Are there any changes it's envisaging?
Well, we made a lot of changes. I think we were in quite a long time, in fairness. And the other constraint of the government, as well as only being in 4.5 years, it's in coalition. So I suspect if you spoke privately to, Secretaries of State from the Liberal Democrat side or from the Conservative side, they would perhaps like to see some more changes to machinery government, but they just think the constraints of coalition have not meant it's deliverable. I think with all of this, I think you've got to resist that temptation just to kind of, that it's a kind of, you want to do something that is cobbled together, in the kind of wee small hours of a reshuffle, to give a kind of rebranding, and to give a line for the media for the next day on a government reshuffle. I think there are some changes that really worked, but I think it is better that they are a result of quite lengthy work. So I think one of the ones that worked, for instance, was in 2002 when the Department of Transport was taken away, when the old DTLR was broken up, that had been the old DETR, that had been sort of John Prescott's empire in the first term. I think that was an inevitable and really sensible decision. I have to say, in 2002, if you'd asked me in the summer of 2002 whether I thought that was the case, I might have said no, not least because I ended up losing my job in the process. But it struck me at the time when I was in that department that it just wasn't fit for purpose. It didn't work, that you needed a separate department for transport. I'm not saying that every single other change that we made was either long-lasting or proved to be the right thing to do, but I think it's important that we reflect on those. And I know there's some work going on to see whether we do need to make some changes to the machinery of government. But equally, there's a bit of resistance that we shouldn't just make changes for the sake of it, that there should be an overwhelming and compelling case when you make these machinery of government changes, because the upheaval itself, is something that can be quite traumatic and can take a while to bed in.
Yeah, there's some scars from the DS and one or two other experiments like that, which are...
Like I said, Peter, we were in a long time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Greg Rosen, Consultant Director at Reform. Michael, in your excellent speech, you highlighted both the importance of, as you were just saying to Sue, of improving expertise, as well as bringing in experts and also reforming the fast stream. One of the several excellent recommendations of the Fulton Commission that Whitehall chose not to implement was to rebalance the focus on the fast stream so that you had equivalent institutional recruitment mid-career. So instead of focusing on bringing everyone in age 23 and bringing them up from there, so that you had brilliant people but with no external expertise at all, you had an equivalent mid-career recruitment process, bringing people in their 30s who might have spent 10, 12 years in, for example, the commercial world, in other areas, so that you could bring that in. That was something that was briefly sort of tried but quickly shelved and has never really been properly taken seriously. Is that something you'd revisit?
Well, our proposals on the fast stream are just our initial proposals. I think we'd like to make further changes that increase the diversity and effectiveness of the civil service. I think you're right in terms of providing opportunities for people mid-career. That's not just about, people who maybe want to begin a career in the civil service in their 40s, maybe they've had commercial experience before, or maybe they've just done other things and they're starting career late. It's also about the civil servants themselves, and there are a few more pockets of good examples than probably we get credit for. So I've chatted to civil servants in the past who talked about how there'd be much more aggressive attempts to go around the country and find current civil servants who might be on a particular grade, doing a particular function, but identifying the brightest and best of the current civil service that are maybe, you know, in a particular job in a particular part of the country, and you think, well, this person, you know, might not have just come out of Oxford and Cambridge and, you know, walked into the civil service exam when they were 21, but actually this is someone in their 40s who's a brilliant public servant, who's a brilliant leader, and it's for departments to provide opportunities to actually get the best of some of their own people as well, and to talent spot from within their own ranks as well. So it shouldn't be just that one chance at the beginning of their career. I think you need to build in a number of opportunities. I think that'd be good for people. I certainly think it'd be good for government.
Just one final thing before we wind up. One of the big innovations since 2010 has been Francis Maude has been a Minister for the Civil Service who'd really cared about the job. Because in the past, a lot of people occupying the post have been either on the way up or the way down. It's been a year.
Which one am I then?
Well,
very
no,
diplomatically.
I'm offering you, Michael, I'm offering you a different opportunity. Is that
you want to keep me there?
Is that somebody who's actually, committed to civil service reform and has wanted to stay in the job. Yeah. And because in the past it's been very much a rite of passage. You saw that when you were an advisor.
Yeah, I think he stayed in the job. I think you could make an argument that he wanted to stay in the job, but it certainly would be an issue of debate. But I think certainly one of the broader criticisms is that when you get a lot of chopping and changing amongst ministers, it's the old yes minister, Sir Humphrey kind of power dynamic. As he's sort of talking to Bernard, he'd be saying, Bernard, you will have 40 years in the civil service. Ministers have an average. I think from the programme, very much from the sort of 70s, said ministers have an average tenure of 11 months, and that does kind of influence things. So I think, look, with the best one in the world, I think all prime ministers try and put people in the jobs who have a vague interest in doing the job and are committed to it. I would hope that that's something that's not going to divide the parties. I think it's helpful when people are given a reasonable go at a job. So I can't moan about, one of the problems is the rotation of civil servants in particular jobs, but then kind of say, but it's obviously okay for politicians to keep moving around and about. I mean, events, dear boys, the other thing that kind of affects these things as well. But I think having some continuity and some stability amongst ministerial appointments is certainly a good thing to aim for, because I do think that can make a big difference. And I think in fairness to Francis Maude, he has been very, very focused on this agenda and very determined to do it. I've been incredibly critical of Francis in lots of the things he's done. I don't have a reputation in the House of Commons as someone, I think, who lets Conservative ministers off the hook. But I hope today that we've set out in a very reasonable way, by looking at the detail of what they've actually changed, the areas where we have major concerns, where we've got serious objections, where we want to make big changes, but equally some of the areas where we think the government has done the right thing and where it'll be for Labour in 2015 to build on that.
Well, thank you very much indeed, because I'm exactly taking up what you just said, Michael. What you've done today is answer a lot of questions. I have a fancy there'll be quite a lot of memos being written after today's event back to bits of the civil service saying, this is what they're going to do. Because I think in a lot of areas you filled out a lot of substance of what a Labour government would do. The balance of continuity and change is absolutely fascinating. And it's also particularly...
So can I just sorry to interrupt, just on that point, as well as the memos that people will file back to each other, you can send us those memos as well. I gave quite a lengthy answer. I apologise to the gentleman who asked about open policy making. But one of the purposes of an event like this is not so I can just make a speech and tell you what our thinking is at the moment. It's to give you some sense of a process that ought to be part of wider engagement. And looking at the sort of list of people who are at the event, we want you to be involved in shaping some of those changes over the coming months. Well,
absolutely, and certainly the IFG Week and on our website provide a similar opportunity for broadening debate. We did it recently with a speech by Martin Donnelly, the Permanent Secretary at BIS, which opened a debate up, and we'll be returning to that theme later in the autumn. Also, in 2 days' time, we're going to be producing a document called Programme for Effective Government, which is to address the questions of politicians. I mean, indeed, you've answered a lot of the questions we pose in that. And that's addressed to if you want to deal with tackle the deficit, tackle long-term policy challenges, sustain growth, and so on. Here's what you've got to look at as governing challenges. And we're going to be reducing that in 2 days' time, you know, whatever your policies are, because it's very important, as you've been saying today, to get that right if you're going to succeed. Otherwise, you're going to trip up. So on behalf of you all in the audience, can I thank you enormously for coming here today and for giving a speech of some substance and answering questions, and indeed, you're saying actually starting a debate.
Thank you. Thanks very much.